camera. I'm going to share my screen here. Can you see this? Why is this not? Okay, here we go. Allegedly, oh, start video. That's why. There I am. How fun. All right. Let's stand here. So, you guys should have presumably already watched this lecture, right? But we're going to talk about some of the things. So first of all, let's just, all right, next slide. Here we go. There we go. So first things first, how do we define a theory? This is going to be discussion. Don't feel like you have to write this down. How would you guys define a theory, especially given that you guys have already watched this lecture some, or presumably you've seen some of this? How would you, if someone said, wow, you're taking a theory class, what are you learning about? Like, what is a theory? It's in the title of the course. It's a good idea to know it. Just shout out something. Anything. Go ahead.
Something that has research or resources to back it up.
So it could be something that has research or resources to back it up, but is that good enough, right? Because there's research to back up the fact that taking an antibiotic will kill a bacteria infection. Is that a theory, though? Not necessarily. So proofs are an interesting idea in social science in general, right? Because we don't prove anything in social science. We can either support or falsify a theory, but even still, not necessarily, because we can test and support theories, even though it's not a proof. Go ahead.
Aren't they supposed to be like simple?
They should be simple to define. So that's a characteristic of a theory, right? Theories should be simple to define, right? And so we'll talk about this in general. Can theories be proven? We've already talked about that. And are theories different from fact? Yes. In what way? So we're getting back to the definition of a theory, right? So theories are ideas or testable propositions. Are they different from fact? This is where it gets, the answer is kind of, we're going to punt on it a little bit, right? Because in some regards, they are different from facts, right? Because two hydrogens and an oxygen always and all the time will give you what? Water. I was hoping for a little more resounding answer to that. But two hydrogens and an oxygen will always give you water. In social science especially, right, I can't predict with 100% certainty that anything will happen with human behavior, right? Nobody can. However, we can say more likely than not, in this situation, this thing will happen, right? And so theories, just because you subscribe to a theory, one of the things that makes people sound extremely ignorant when they're talking about social science, or whenever you read a Facebook argument, is when someone says, well, that's just a theory, right? Because while it's true that a theory maybe can be completely unsupported and completely grounded, not in reality in any capacity, there is also, and there should be at least for good theories, some sort of empirical falsification that happens. And I'll give you an example between two things, right? I reviewed a book last year, and it was a whole book with a variety of studies on guns, right? And whether or not guns were bad or evil, or the reason why all of our societies have problems, right? And there were a lot of chapters that proposed theories that were completely untested. And one of the chapters suggested that basically, using kind of a Freudian psychoanalytic approach, that men, specifically white men, prefer to carry guns or play with guns or use guns because they view it as an extension of their genitalia, and it makes them feel more like men when they walk around with guns. And basically, they're just trying to compensate for their lack of male parts. That is a theory, right? How would you test that theory? How could you falsify that theory? There are some ways you could try to test it, right? What can you do? Ask a bunch of guys if they feel like they got small things, right? And maybe they'll self-report and say yes. And when I carry a gun, it makes me feel like a man. However, that theory really is kind of not grounded in this place I like to call reality, right? And so because of that, you can't, because the testing of the theory is weak at best, it's really hard to empirically support that theoretical idea, right? However, if you have a theoretical idea that, and this is a theory we'll talk about later on in class, I'm not showing the picture yet. If you have a theoretical idea that maybe that friends are able to predict behavior, right? So if you look at who you are, like any individual, if you look at their 3 or 4 closest friends, you can kind of predict their basic attitudes and beliefs about the world. That's a theory that we can test, right? Ask an individual what their attitudes and beliefs are in the world, ask their 3 or 4 best friends what their attitudes or beliefs are in the world, and compare them to each other. And maybe not always on every issue, but overwhelmingly, and I bet if you were to stop and kind of think about your friends, you guys all probably have very similar beliefs about politics, maybe very similar religious beliefs, kind of the same general morality. And that's part of why you guys can hang out with each other, right? Because you guys don't disagree a lot. If you're constantly arguing with someone or constantly bickering with someone, you probably don't want to hang out with them all that much. So that theory, as a theory, isn't necessarily a really earth-shattering theory, but it is a theory that we're able to test and empirically falsify or support, right? So a theory can be any kind of proposition about real situations, feelings, experiences, or human behavior, and it helps us kind of make sense of facts we already know. Another theory that we've kind of talked about is this idea that maybe people in lower socioeconomic statuses commit more crime than people in higher socioeconomic statuses. Even if that is not necessarily true in terms of total crime, you could at least make the argument there are different types of crimes that are committed by different socioeconomic classes. And you can test that theory empirically. And so a theory is an answer to commonly asked questions about events or behaviors. And we've already talked about on the first day that every policy or action taken regarding crime is based on some sort of theory, right? So now that we have a clearly defined definition of what a theory is, we need to also know how to best evaluate the theory. So if I fly ahead a couple slides, don't get mad at me, all right? So categories of theories, we're not going to worry about that. So how annoying is it that the end is not up with evaluation? Isn't that terrible? And you know how easy that would be for me to fix, but I never remember until I'm standing in class to fix it. So in evaluating a theory, you can't just say, this theory feels good to me in my heart, right? That's a really bad reason to like a theory or evaluate a theory. So how do you do it? Well, these all have their own slides, so don't feel like you have to draw this picture down. And also, this is all on YouTube, on the video, so you should have all this written down, right? So the theory has to be logically consistent, have broad scope, be parsimonious, be testable, have empirical validity, and have evaluating the policy implications. The policies have to make sense and be like legal and ethical when we're talking about these theories, right? So let's talk about all these. We're going to do it briefly because, again, you have this all from the lectures online. So the theory has to be internally consistent. Not only does the theory have to make sense, right, but it has to be internally consistent. So, for example, there's a theory that suggests criminals are biologically different than non-criminals. There's a biological difference that makes criminals criminal. However, if that theory tests it by saying, who do you hang out with? Who are your peers? Do you hang out with other criminals? Does that seem to make sense? Not really. If you're biologically different, who you hang out with doesn't matter. If the theory is, right, we always hear this with serial killers, the theory is they have abusive parents, right? If the way that they test this is to take everyone who has abusive parents and say you're all serial killers, is that accurate? No, probably not, right? And so there needs to be some sort of internal consistency. The theory shouldn't have contradictions, and also the concepts need to be clearly defined. Clearly defined concepts is one of the main ways that theories in general in the world fall apart. And we're going to take, this is where we're going to kind of shift from our regularly scheduled program to talk about current events, right? One of the big movements right now with law enforcement in America and policing in America is this idea of defunding the police, right? What does that mean? Paying them less? Good.
Give less money to fund departments.
Give less money to fund police departments?
Less resources.
Less resources. That could be money, that could be other resources. Could it mean completely eliminating a police force? Certainly. Give them a $0 budget. Who's going to work for free? I don't. Right? I get paid cents an hour. It's great. I'm just kidding. But, right, so those are all different things. Paying people less is different than eliminating the police department, right? Reallocating resources away from law enforcement to mental health counseling or community programs, community outreach in some capacity is different than draining their budget down to zero. Does that movement, does that idea have a clearly defined concept of what it means to defund the police? No. And so because of that, it's really hard to see if that's a good idea or not, because depending on who you talk to, depends on what the idea is. And there are all sorts of areas in our lives where we see that, right? We see the goalpost constantly moving in modern politics for, well, I like Donald Trump. It's not like he says X. And then if he says X, well, yeah, but it's not like he said Y, right? And the same thing is true with Joe Biden, right? We're okay with Joe Biden. No, Joe Biden really does know what's going on. He's awake most of the time until, well, maybe he's not. And then it's like, well, that's different. It was after 6. And so we constantly are redefining what we mean by a certain concept, which means the theory can't possibly be consistent because we're constantly changing the definition. Pay attention to that as you watch Facebook arguments unfold, right? Or political arguments in general unfold, and listen for what people say. And even if you ask people, what do you mean by that? When you say X, what do you mean by that? And oftentimes they won't have a clear definition because the reality is they don't really care about a clear definition and they're trying to push their side's agenda in some capacity, right? And so in order for a theory to have logical consistency, that is a very important element that the concepts are clearly defined. Scope is not all that complicated or difficult to understand. It basically means the best theories account for all types of criminal behavior, right? I might be able to have a really, really good theory that predicts underage drinking. And that theory is you're in college, right? And that basically predicts you're probably going to drink. Probabilistically, I'm not encouraging this, by the way, but probabilistically, you're going to drink underage, right? However, if the policy for that is tighter, monitoring of dorm rooms, that's not a great policy to stop homicides in America, right? If we just control the dorm rooms more, there'd be less homicides. Because there's not a lot of homicides that take place on college campuses, right? And so that theory might do a really good job of explaining underage drinking, but it does a really bad job of explaining any other type of crime, right? Maybe Adderall slinging, right? Because we all like to sell drugs to each other, prescription drugs to each other like that, around finals week and midterms and stuff. That's actually, by the way, just as a side note, and this can be like a fun exam question. Like Adderall or study drugs are actually the #1 most used and abused illegal drug, assuming you don't have a prescription for it, on college campuses. You ask most people like weed or coke or something, nope. It's like Adderall or Vyvanse or those study drugs. Because, also, by the way, why do you think that is? There's a couple of reasons for why that is. Good? So, I love that critical view of students. I wasn't going to be that mean. But yeah, so there is students procrastinate, right? That is true. But what else? There's something unique about the college environment, right? Most people don't have like exams, and so they don't necessarily need to take study enhancing drugs in any capacity. But there's also a second issue with it. How many people feel like it's wrong to take someone else's Adderall? No, I'm not asking you to raise your hand and be like, I'm taking a stand. But don't we say like, well, it's not weed, it's not coke, it's not meth, right? We kind of like, that's a prescription. A doctor gave that to somebody, to my roommate or to my friend. So it's not actually wrong because a doctor prescribed it. Well, doctors prescribe, Lortab all the time and Oxycontin. That doesn't mean you should be popping those in the morning either, right? Write that down. So scope, right? The best theories explain a wide variety of crime because then you can make a policy that targets the widest variety of crimes, right? So parsimony. There should be as few concepts and propositions as possible to explain the widest range of phenomenon. So what that means is that a theory that basically says something like, for example, low self-control causes crime is a much better theory than a theory that states that age, race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, all of these things predict crime together, because there's far too many variables, which means you can't really predict anything with any sort of certainty, right? It's like if you happen to be a male who was born on a Tuesday in the year 1988, which is the year I was born, great year, you're welcome, that was born to two parents and his mother's name was Helen, he's likely to be awesome, which I am. But, right, it's far too specific, and you can't really institute any sort of real policies with that theory because it's not parsimonious. So parsimony is a important variable as well. Testability. This is something that drives people nuts, right? If a theory is untestable, it actually has no scientific value. This is where, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, this is where kind of the schism between sociology and criminology kind of happened that made them into separate fields. Criminology used to be a subfield of sociology, and in fact, it was just like the sociology of deviance, right? Most of my professors at UF got their PhDs in sociology because they didn't have criminology PhDs at the time that they got the PhDs. Now, obviously, there's plenty of PhD granting institutions in criminology. But if the theory is not testable, right? It isn't actually science, it's more ideology. And this is where criminology said, we're going to make it to where you need to test your theories in order for them to be valid. Sociology doesn't mind as much, and that's where you get theories that say carrying guns are just guys with small private parts trying to make themselves feel better, right? And it's completely untestable and just something that feels good in your heart, right? And so it has to be also, it can't be measured by voodoo, right? It needs to be measured by objective, repeatable evidence. So if your psychic told you that something happened, but it was only your psychic and no other psychic can see the future, like your psychic can, it's a problem, right? So a theory cannot just fit known facts about crime. It has to be subject to empirical falsification. This is incredibly important because you hear theories all the time that are completely untestable. And not only is there no empirical support for them, which we'll talk about on the next slide, but you can't even attempt to try and test the theory. This is one of the big issues that a lot of people have with any sort of religion. Prove God. Pretty hard to do, right? That's why it takes faith to believe in any sort of religion, right? And so, and I'm not suggesting that we should all be atheists, quite the opposite. Actually, I like Jesus. And so it's just faith is separate from science, right? And it's very, very hard to prove any sort of existence in any sort of capacity. Common reasons a theory is untestable. This first one is one of the most important, right? Tautological issues. This is basically circular reasoning. You'll see this all the time. I want to make sure that the screen can see the board here because I'm going to draw pretty pictures. Am I allowed to use these? No? So, how do we know somebody is an alcoholic? How do we know somebody is an alcoholic? What do they do? They drink a lot of alcohol, right? An alcoholic, because they drink a lot. Why do they drink a lot? Because, in fact, they have a disease. It's called alcoholism. But why do they have alcoholism? Well, it's because they drink a lot. What have I found out? Nothing at all, right? So one thing that you will see a lot of theories do in criminology, and I cannot explain why this happens, but you know in science in general, the scientific method, we have an independent variable and a dependent variable, right? They'll use the independent variable. This is the predictive variable, right? The dependent variable is crime. And then they'll ask people in a survey, do you commit crime? And they'll say, yes, I commit crime. And they'll say, see, I can predict this person's a criminal. Like, well, yeah, you're using the fact that they commit crime to predict they're a criminal? You've helped figure out all sorts of things for us, right? It's not particularly helpful. And so because of that, right, the theories become useless because it's no different than an alcohol drinking a lot, right? Another reason why theories are untestable is that the propositions are so open-ended that any contrary evidence can be reinterpreted to support the theory. Right now in American society, right, there is a belief that Donald Trump is what? Sure, really anyist, right? You could have filled in blanks there. What is the evidence that he is racist? He makes comments. That's good. So, right, if Donald Trump comes out after the Kenosha, Wisconsin shootings and says, I condemn violence, how will people still justify the fact that he's a racist? He didn't condemn it quick enough, furiously enough. It's in Donald Trump's America that this is allowed to happen, right? So clearly he is racist. Basically anything Donald Trump does is able to get spun into he is racist. Why? There is no clear definition of what we mean by racism, and the proposition we've allowed to be so open-ended that anything he does can be spun into racism. Right now, I am not a Donald Trump apologist, so please don't interpret this as me saying, 4 more years. But regardless, right, one of the problems with such an open-ended definition of racism and allowing anything to be racist is then what? If anything someone does is racist, don't people get tired of hearing it? And then if real racism happens, what happens? Like, oh, not again. Jeez Louise, we're hearing this nonsense again, right? It's basically the boy who cried wolf, right? Which is more or less what the media has been doing for the past 40 years in everything, right? They have a shit fit. That's a legal term. Anytime anything happens in the White House, right? It doesn't matter what it is. It's like, oh my gosh, Donald Trump got his steak medium well, which I agree is a travesty. But is that really a big deal? Not really, right? So in a more pure chronological example, right, we'll learn about a theory that suggests that irrational or unconscious desires to have sex with your mother, right, this Oedipus complex, are what causes crime. And it's hugely ironic because if I said, who wants to have sex with their mom? No one raised their hand, please. But no one raised their hand. I say, see, that's how unconscious the desires are. You don't even know you have them. But if someone raises their hand, I can say, see, told you so, right? So no matter how you answer, I'm right. I wish that was the case in marriage. I find myself wrong a lot. Also, the concepts might not be measurable by observable repeated events. For example, demon possession. How do you know that this person is possessed? Oh, I am very spiritual. If only you were as spiritual as me, you would know they are possessed by a demon, right? So these are all common reasons why a theory can be untestable. And if it's untestable, it has no scientific value. Now, as important as testability is, and it's extremely important, what's even more important is if it is testable, what are the results, right? Does it work? Is it empirically valid? Criminology is an inherently quantitative field. We've already said that. Empirical validity is the single most important criteria in judging a theory, right? This essentially means that the theory, when tested, actually has an effect, right? We actually see that X is causing Y to happen, right? A theory can meet every other criteria, but if it fails, the theory is useless and it's been falsified. It's wrong. Ironically, we know a lot of theories that are wrong that we still have policies for. We already talked about DARE, right, on the first day of class. And so one of the questions becomes what degree of empirical support is adequate, and that is something that's kind of hotly debated. and a little bit outside the scope of an undergraduate level course. But in grad school, that's actually one of the things that you'll learn about a lot should you decide to pursue criminology further. But what degree of empirical support is adequate is somewhat up for debate. However, what's not up for debate is if the theory under testing fails, it's a bad theory. Now, some theories fail over and over and over again, and people argue it's because the test is bad, and that could be the case, right? But if you've tested it a bunch of different ways and it keeps failing, it's probably not the best theory in the world, right? Kind of like if a student keeps failing tests, that subject is probably not the best for them, which is why I took math for liberal arts majors in undergrad, because calculus was the whole situation. So once they started putting letters in math, I was done. Empirical validity also does not mean that the proposition always causes crime. And this is an important distinction as well, right? There's a difference between a necessary condition and a sufficient condition. Water always needs hydrogen, right? You cannot have water without hydrogen in it. No question about it. You don't, our humans always need blood, right? No question about it, blood is required. However, right, there's a sufficient condition, right? Like steak tastes better if it's seasoned. Sure, you can eat an unseasoned steak, but people aren't really going to like it all that much, right? You can live without kidneys and go get dialysis all the time. So kidneys are not necessary for life like a heart or a brain, but they're a pretty sufficient condition to live your fullest life, right? And so, for example, right, one of the best theories of crime suggests that who you hang out with predicts your own behavior, right? And so if you hang out with a bunch of criminals, you're probably going to commit criminal acts, which is why your parents always get all worked up about who your friends are, at least probably used to in elementary school and middle school. Just because, though, you hang out with friends, if 80% of people will commit crime, that still means 20% won't, right? And so it is a sufficient condition. It's probabilistically going to cause you to commit crime, but it might not. I could be a recovered alcoholic, right? And I could work in a bar and be totally fine because I'm recovered and never have a sip of alcohol. Probabilistically, if I'm a recovering alcoholic and get a job at a bar, what's going to happen? Probabilistically, I'm going to start drinking again, right? So it's a sufficient enough condition that we can say this is predictive of that drinking behavior, but it's not guaranteed that that drinking behavior is going to happen. Because human behavior is exceedingly complex, right? If you put two dogs in a room, a male dog and a female dog that have not been fixed, and the female dog is in heat, probabilistically, those dogs almost always are going to mate with each other, right? And that's sometimes why you get these weird dogs that like half German Shepherd, half, Chihuahua. Because it's like, oh, you're in heat, I'm ready to go, and then they mate, right? And you hope the Chihuahua was the man in that situation, right? The same situation with humans, right, is not necessarily true. You can put a sexually mature male and a sexually mature female in a room, and there needs to be a whole lot more than just sexual maturity for them to get married and have babies, right? So there's necessary versus sufficient conditions. There's also the probabilistic concept of causality, right? This is basically what I just said. Virtually all behavioral theories are probabilistic, and it's a soft determinism, right? This recognizes that there are various factors that influence and limit actions, but also leave room for individual choice that cannot be completely predicted. I one time walked out of a CVS when I was in high school, and there was a $20 bill right there on the sidewalk. So I picked it up, and you know what I did with it? I walked it right back inside and turned it into the lost and found. My mother, my father, and my grandparents both basically suggested that I should be institutionalized because I was crazy, right? They said, what is the matter with you? You're never going to see that $20 again. No one's going to come back and say, hey, do I happen to drop a 20 outside of a CVS? However, joke's on them. 3 weeks later, the CVS called and said, no one picked up your money. You can come get it now. and it was mine, finders keepers. So I showed them, right? But, right, what would 9 out of 10 people have done if they found that $20? And what should I have probably done when I found that $20 bill outside? Yeah, said, all right, Taco Bell's on me tonight. Right? You can get a lot of Taco Bell for $20. Like a lot of chalupas. Beef supreme. No tomatoes. In case you went to my order. All right. So that's self-determinism. Yes, probabilistically, most people would have pocketed it, but that doesn't take out the idea of individual choice in some capacity, right? The quality of the empirical tests also matter, right? Not all empirical tests are of the same quality, right? They have to have correctly specified hypotheses. They have to have the correct participant group, which doesn't always happen. They have to correctly measure all the concepts. This is a huge problem also, right? And they should use more than one measure for each concept, and they should reliably and correctly measure the concepts. If you have bad methods, you will get bad results, right? If I wanted to know who knows the most about criminal theory, so at the midterm, we're all going to stand outside on King Street and we're going to run a race, and the first 3 people to finish the race get an A. Is that the best way to test who knows a lot about theory? No. Yet, sometimes in research, you see what these tests are and say, look, this has been tested. It's like, well, what in the world are the measures? Because these don't seem to make a whole lot of sense. I can give you a real world example of this actually as it relates to, since we're talking about guns today, as it relates to gun control. The vast majority of gun control studies say when strict gun laws are put in place, gun violence goes down, right? And that's evidence that, thank God, gun control works. However, you know what doesn't go down? Violent crime rates or homicide rates. Because, as we talked about before, it turns out if you want to kill someone and you don't have a gun, you don't say, oh, rats, I guess you live. You come up with some other way to kill somebody, right? So having the gun there doesn't actually stop you from committing any sort of violent crime, right? And so it's a bad research method that gives us bad results to support a bad policy, right? Because largely gun control just doesn't work. And so this is why empirical tests and empirical falsification is so important. And then finally, policy implications, right? A good theory should be useful in some capacity, right? And so what of the theory? Great. Now we know why people commit crime. What do we do about it, right? The better the theory explains the problem, the better the theory guides the solution also. However, the real question becomes, how well is the policy guided by the theory, and then how good is the theory? So we have a great theory, but if the policy is sketchy, right? So again, social learning theory says who you hang out with will predict your behavior, right? Can I force you to hang out with a different friend group and say, you now find those people cool? Oftentimes not, right? What can I say, you might only like blondes, you now like brunettes? Not really, right? It just doesn't work like that. And so we have a good theory to explain why crime happens, but it's really, really difficult to get people to hang out with a different group or associate with different people, because if people don't like them or think they're losers, they're not going to want to hang out with them anymore, right? And they're going to want to naturally go back to their old group. And so policy implications are only as good as the theory, but also only as good as they implement the theory in their policies. There is some evidence to suggest that religious conversion, right, specifically conversion to Christianity, and doing faith-based correctional programs reduces recidivism for at least 3 to 5 years. Can we force people to become Christians? For a couple reasons. That pesky Constitution gets in the way, right? But also, how can you force someone to have a religious conversion? That's impossible. You can't say, you now love the Lord. It has been written, right? That doesn't change anything about your behavior. That's impossible, right? Now, with all of this being said, don't worry about this. You guys can see this online. This is the thrust of what is important to talk about today and is an exceedingly important point that we need to remember throughout this whole semester. Theory is and should be absent of all emotion and principle. You might really, really like a theory on its face, and I promise you, when we learn about labeling theory later on, you guys are going to love it and say this is the greatest thing I've ever heard. Because everyone loves it every semester, right? Just because you like it and it fits with your morality is a really, really bad reason to adopt a theory. And yet something that the vast majority of people do all the time, right? A theory, this says it's something that can be proven. That's an overstatement, and I want to make that very, very clear, but that is an overstatement. I shouldn't say proven, but it's something that can be supported. Your ideologies, if they're unsupported, shouldn't be your ideologies anymore, right? Or shouldn't be your belief about how something happens. A desire for a just, fair, and effective criminal justice system is not a theory, right? That is something that we can all strive for, something we should strive for. That's not a theory. There should be no guns in America is not a theory. Discrimination should not be part of our criminal justice system is not a theory. Those are all fine ideas. I have no problem with any one of those ideas if that's what you believe, but that is not a theoretical idea. Low self-control causes crime is a theory, right? And something that can be tested, and it has clear hypotheses and measurements, right? The weakest reason, and something that is always, always, always going to be a terrible reason for accepting a theory, is that it lines up with your own ideologies. And unfortunately, in society today, that is all we look for when it comes to accepting things. Does this line up with what I believe? Yes. Thank God, that's what I believe in. That clearly must be true because it lines up with what I already believe, right? I bet there are people, not necessarily in this classroom, right? But whenever I talk about gun control, and I know this for a fact because students push back on this every semester, that say, that's not true, gun control works. And when I say, show me the evidence that shows that it works, because there's usually a lot of methodological flaws with a lot of the research in gun control, they say, well, it's out there. You can't ever show it to me. And when they do show it to me, I point out the flaws in the research, they have nothing to say, right? And this is sometimes other PhDs in criminology, right? Or criminal justice. Or they'll point out the limitations in one particular study, but then 5 or 6 other studies that have similar limitations, they accept this fact in other capacities, right? So don't, please, 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 in society today right now, we have way too many people pushing ideology masked as science, ideology masked as an educated opinion, literally masked. See my phone? That is, I want better for all of you, right? I want you guys to actually be educated members of society and not just push some agenda because it feels right. Because again, the weakest reason for accepting anything is because it lines up with what you already believe, which is unfortunately what happens. And we see that happening all the time, right? With George Floyd in Minneapolis, or Jacob Blake in Wisconsin, right? Both sides came out strongly in support of their side before any actual evidence was presented in any capacity. Both sides had a conniption before there was any sort of real in-depth look into what happened. Why? Because their ideology is more important than the reality on the ground. And that is obviously, as we can see in American society today, a very, very dangerous place to live and operate. So with that being said, does anyone have any questions? All right, can everyone please come grab one of these thingies and clean up your desk to make sure that we don't spread the disease. Go Gators. Go America.